Stanley Robinson, who I really think needs no introduction. Let's do a quick straw poll. How many people have read at least one book of the Mars trilogy? There we go. I think that says it all. How many people who have not read a Mars trilogy but have read something else by Stan? Okay, I think that's most of it. So I'm not going to introduce him. I'll spend a lot of time talking about myself. No, just kidding. I'm Gideon Lichfield. I'm the MIT Technology Reviews Editor-in-Chief. And Stan's books, I've read more of Stan's books than I've read of any other writers. And I think that he, when I was just starting out as a science fiction, as a science journalist, more than 20 years ago, I read the Mars trilogy, and it blew my mind because it was the first time, I'd read a lot of the classics and space operas, and it was the first time that I read something that I could really call, introduced me to the idea of a future history. A notion that you would make a really serious attempt to examine how things might play out in a relatively near future scenario. And then the other thing about it that blew my mind was that lots of science fiction writers make a decent attempt at trying to explain the physics of a warp drive, or they will do hard science fiction that focuses on one particular aspect of the science. But here's you going into this remarkable detail, not only about the physics and the chemistry and the biology of landing on Mars, but also the soil chemistry and the ecology and the economics and the politics. And there's a bit where you're talking about the bricks that they're using to build the first habitats, and that the bricks don't have enough tensile strength, so they're mixing the nylon from the parachute fabric in order to... And it's just this insane level of erudition, seemingly, on so many different fields. So I guess my first question is, how did you, an English major, become this knowledgeable?
Well, insane is the crucial word there. It's a matter of research and the craft and stage magic of writing sentences, and also the clarity of the sciences in general, in that, as opposed to some fields in the humanities that I won't name right now, the sciences want to be understood, and if you read their abstracts and get yourself a basic scientific literacy, then anything that a scientist has written about is meant to be understood by the general public. Sometimes that's not possible, but most of the time it is. Warp drives you can't explain, but the geology of why the Mars surface looks like it looks can be explained. And I got really lucky in that the Mariner and Viking missions, the Viking missions gave us Mars in a way that we had never had before, not even remotely close. So you couldn't have written the Mars trilogy until after 1976, but there was also some processing time. And I started reading in about 1980, the Michael H. Carr, The Surface of Mars. This was for the general audience, what Viking had found out. And that could be put into a book in a way that couldn't have happened before. And then the craft of it in literary terms comes out of 100 Years of Solitude and out of Proust. If you think of fiction as just being one dramatized scene after the next, happening at a kind of a real time of lived experience, and dramatized means like from the theater, and you're kind of watching a movie in your head, you write a novel that covers 200 years and you're doomed from the start. So what you have to understand is that novels also include summarization, and that summarization can be good. And there can be exposition, and exposition can be good. And also, Proust has the pseudo-iterative. We used to do this every day. We would go out. And so you can, in almost a poetical way, describe a way of life that lasted a month or 20 years. And by combining all these techniques, I was able to do the 200 years of the Mars trilogy in one novel that admittedly it's 1,800 pages or whatever it is. It's pretty long, but we've seen longer in our genre. I can mention some 10,000 page novels, and probably they dramatized every scene. I haven't bothered to read most of those. But that's how I managed to pull it together. It was a combination of the information from Mars and my own comprehension of the novel as a form. And this was like novel 6 or 7 for me, Red Mars. And I had been seriously frustrated by my previous novel of what you couldn't do doing normal dramatized scenes. So I had to throw everything out and start over again in the sense of how to construct a novel. And I also trusted the science fiction audience. Okay, I'm going to do something crazy and stupid. Well, so what? I've got my audience. They've not seen crazy, stupid things before, and it made me bold to have this kind of thing.
Right. But how do you marshal both the knowledge? So, for instance, that knowledge about bricks and what kind of materials will go into bricks, and knowing where to slot that into the story, and keeping track of the lives of these. I mean, they're the first 100, but really, ultimately, dozens of characters that you track over the period of this novel.
Well, there's two parts to that. The bricks being strengthened by nylon from the parachutes, comes from the case for Mars, the Mars Underground. Chris McKay, Zubrin, Penny Boston, Carol Stoker. These were University of Colorado grad students in planetology that were interested in the Mars project. They started forming a conference, Case for Mars. They met in Boulder every year. The British journal, what's the name of those space cadets? Journal of the Astronomical Society or British, it's Arthur Clarke's.
Interplanetary Society.
The British Interplanetary Society would publish these Case for Mars conferences, and they would be like, well, what kind of glove sleeve do you need? You're on Mars, you got this light atmosphere, you don't really need a spacesuit, you only need a wetsuit to make sure you don't get bruised, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there was an article of it, the bricks won't be strong enough, but if you have thousands of pounds of parachute silk, nylon, you can grind it in. And so I am an English major still. An idea that good does not come to long. So I read the book.
Right. So since you wrote those, it seems like you're thinking on the colonization, on terraforming of Mars has evolved, because in Aurora, people go off in a generation starship, and the assumption there is that terraforming Mars is not going to take 400 years, it's going to take 40,000 or something like that. And therefore, let's go and look for planets that might be already habitable. But where do you stand, both on the idea of terraforming and also on the idea of habitability of other systems?
The Mars question has gotten really marginal. There's not anywhere near as much nitrogen as there ought to be, and that's a mystery. And so if you're going to terraform Mars, you would need water, you'd need nitrogen, you need an atmosphere, and you need a hydrosphere. And both of them, the quantities of what's there already in volatile terms, it looks to be less than what they thought when I wrote my book. Then, so that's an issue. It's not a stopper. You could use all the water that's there. There's a lot of water there. I don't think that's the issue. The nitrogen thing is weird and troublesome. You need it both for growing plants in a living terrestrial style environment of living things, and it would be nice to have a buffer gas in your atmosphere. You kind of need it. So I've been thinking, well, they'll take automated rocket ships, will steal the atmosphere of Titan and take it and dump it into Mars's atmosphere, blah, blah, blah. That's a timely process if anybody is crazy enough to do that. And then the perchlorates, these salts, are poisonous to humans in the parts per 1,000 range. And on the Martian surface, it's in the parts per 10 range. I mean, there's a lot of perchlorates on the surface. Chris McKay tells me that the moment that you hydrate the surface, the perchlorates break down into something that's not poisonous to us. But meanwhile, Mars is more poisonous to us than we thought. And then lastly, there might be bacteria on the basement regolith still living on Mars. It's a long shot. Chris McKay doesn't believe in it. And so if Chris doesn't believe in it, I don't believe in it. Because I basically use Chris McKay as my go-to guy for Mars science. And he has his reasons, and they're pretty plausible. But if there were bacteria down there, when I wrote my Mars trilogy, I just assumed it was a dead rock. The idea that there might be life there was off the table because the scientists at the time said, no way, dead. So these are the problems that have cropped up. And so what I like to say now is Mars might be terraformable, but instead I crushed it down to the minimum length of time that seemed plausible enough to write my book. And there are people who have proposed even faster than my book's timeline, which I'm very much grateful to these people. Again, Brits, crazy. Paul Birch, terraforming Mars quickly, he calls for 50 years. So I loved him. But what if it takes 30,000 years? So what? We're either here and stable, and it's a great project like building Notre Dame or something, or we screwed up and we're dead and it doesn't happen. I mean, the timeline doesn't matter because it's not going to be us, and whoever it is not the point. It would be a species achievement. So I'm still interested, but we got more pressing problems right now, as everybody knows. So.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed to me like the message of Aurora, which is this attempt to colonize another planet, is actually colonizing even what looks like an Earth-like world is going to be really hard, because you're going to get there and you're going to discover that sure, it's got a breathable atmosphere, but in this case, there's a 70-mile-an-hour wind all the time.
Yeah.
And in fact, I have a friend who's writing a book on this subject right now, and part of her point is, anything that looks like an Earth-like planet will be different, even if it's in subtle ways that could render it just unbearable to live on, even if it's technically possible to live on. And I think much of your point in all of your writing has been actually this is our world and we have to fix it.
That is my point. And I want to say to the science fiction audience, to all of you, that I wrote Aurora to say that the intergenerational starship fantasy, and indeed the idea of humanity going out to the stars, is not going to work. It's a Greek idea, it's a Tsiolkovsky idea, it's an early modernist idea. Alas, the universe is too big, not going to happen. So that turns it into a fantasy space. Is that bad? Well, not necessarily. I mean, Tolkien's Middle-earth is a fantasy space. We still have great stories there. I guess what's frustrating is we're seeing the galaxy, we're seeing the universe, we're not going to get there. And so people are still searching for a replacement for religion, for an idea of immortality or an afterlife. And secular people are thinking, well, if that doesn't happen, at least the species is going to conquer the stars, or whatever that fantasy is. Not going to happen. So it's all right. You still have Gene Wolfe's Book of the Long Sun, a great novel set on a starship. By God, one of the greatest novels ever, in my opinion. It's a story space, and it's a great story space. But I would love to be put up here against those hard SF writers, supposedly hard, very porous hardness, I must say, and have a debate in front of you or and God as to whether this starship fantasy will work or not. And Aurora's been slayed by these people, mostly through misreading or even flat out lying about the book. And if we had a fair jury, I would kick their ass. The universe is on my side in this particular question. And why they want this to be a realistic thing is their own religious problem. It's not my problem. So that was what Aurora was about. And of course it made for a great story. I mean, you get to another planet. I mean, first of all, you're dying when you get there, but you get there. Well, the planet is either alive or it's dead. If it's alive, it could be friendly. They could the bugs, it could be that they don't have any impact on us. Could be neutral, could be positive, could be bad. You don't know until you try it. So you're stuck in your ship until you get the experiments run on finding these bugs, testing these bugs. Or it's a dead planet and you got to terraform it. And again, it's going to be Mars is like a best case scenario. Anywhere else, it's going to be another 20,000 years in your starship waiting to terraform your damn planet with very little purchasing power, physical power to do the job. So the whole thing it was a thing that I needed to say, and it gave me a new story. I'm quite pleased with Aurora as a story, even though it makes some people want to kill me, but that's good too, right?
Given the passion with which you embark on intellectual exercises like these stories, it's striking to me that you've never tried to imagine an alien civilization. Why is that? Is it just not interesting?
Solaris, Stanislaw Lem. It seems to me that the point of Solaris is great and incontrovertible. That if there was an alien intelligence, the whole novel would be stuck at the level of we can't understand them and they can't understand us. And he tells that story so wonderfully in Solaris that I believe the job has been done there. That's sort of like the Aurora of alien novels, in that it's turning the alien story into a kind of a fantasy. And there would be good stories about aliens, because aliens are always the other. So you got some weird squid-like creature or whatever. It's a metaphor for the other. And that could be your identical twin, or, everything is an other that isn't inside your own consciousness. So the alien story is a very useful story for that kind of metaphorical, poetical value. But nothing ever occurred to me. I would like to check the box of every kind of science fiction story that there is and have made my contribution. And I'm still puzzling over the alien. I can't wrap my head around it. And I think Solaris kind of fills that hole. I mean, I can't get past Solaris to my own story.
I read Peter Watts' Echopraxia recently, and that's sort of an attempt to use the idea of alien intelligence to examine the nature of human intelligence and blow up our assumptions about what our intelligence is and what our consciousness is. Which, so again, I'm listening to that, but it was an interesting, I thought, way to use that.
Well, English majors, I mean, that's really been the last 25 years of literary studies, is trying to blow up consciousness and understand consciousness and deconstruct consciousness. And, as a student of Frederick Jameson, this is like, oh my God. I'm listening to his lectures right now down at Duke. He's talking about existentialism and history. Pascal, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, Camus. And he's riffing on this stuff and blowing my mind. It's very important, existentialism. But you don't really need your alien. I mean, Sartre would just say the look of another human being is already the alien experience in its purest form, so you don't have to go further.
Right. It can feel to me like any science fiction being written now that doesn't deal with climate change is sort of irrelevant. Do you feel that's the case?
No. Because science fiction is a big, big house, and it's a story space, and it includes the next 50 years. That would be near future science fiction, next century. The space opera, Out Amongst the Stars, and in the next million years. Okay, that's a story space, and it's still part of science fiction, and I believe in it. The in-between space I've always been interested in, the kind of solar system in the next 500 years, somewhat emptier zone, despite its huge interest, at least to me. So I've been writing in that zone a lot. And climate change, if you're going to do near-future science fiction, for damn sure you're going to have to be putting climate change in there because we've already started it, and you can't ignore it without doing an alternative history. Like, the only story I've ever said in Boston, there's a giant glacier coming down the Charles that stops right about at the mouth of the Charles River. I'm thinking, where did that story come from? And it's like from 1987 or something. Those would be alternative histories, and they're still valid, because science fiction is a story space, and it's always been ultra-tolerant of alternative histories, alternative futures. It's just that if you want to do something that is very, the realism of our time, is also a science fiction novel that is set in the now/near future. That I regard as the best literary realism that exists in the world. Then climate change is going to keep coming up.
And how much is there, do you think, to eke out of that? Because you can do a utopian approach where we're somehow coming together to defeat it. You can do a dystopian approach like Paolo Bacignoli does. But do you think there's a lot yet to be done in this near future climate fiction?
I think maybe so. It will be hard. Think about Raymond Williams. At any historical moment like this one has residual elements from the past and emergent elements from the future that are hard to tease out of what's coming, and that's what science fiction is about. So residual and emergent, and that each historical era has its own structure of feeling. So the culture and the general intellect creates a system by which we organize our animal emotions, so that love for the ancient Chinese or for the Greek civilization or for medieval romance or for now, these are, it's the same basic animal emotions, but they're structured by language and by culture into different, what would you call it, bestiaries of emotions. So climate future, the near future, most readers of fiction are coming from the world's middle class, the bourgeois. The novel was built for the bourgeois public. You have to be literate, you have to have time to read, you have to have an interest in it. The novels are basically about you. We're going to get into a new structure of feeling. In climate change, what's it going to be like? Life, decarbonized, and is it going to be, do we have to live like saints with hair shirts? Are we all going to be starving? Are we going to have fully automated luxury communism, on the other hand, and everything's going to be solved by one party or another? What's the social system? And then, crucially, what's it going to feel like? Because that's what function is really about, is how's it going to feel in that future? And because I don't think we're there yet. We're in the period of radical disorientation. And that in itself is an interesting story. The story of our time is the story of the radical disorientation. The future could be utter disaster, complete near extinction event. The future could be stupendously prosperous and glorious golden age utopia. Both equally possible. At that point, you experience a kind of nausea of disorientation. It's like, well, what does that mean? What do I do? How do I react to that emotion? So I think you could do climate fiction as the realism of our time over and over, because the stories never stop.
I think that something that's very closely tied up with the future of the effect of climate change on our world, something that will be a big determinant is really how we govern ourselves, how we socially organize ourselves. And in other words, the technology, the green tech that you use to fight climate change is much less interesting than the political technology that you use to get us to consensus on it. And you're one of the very few writers, I think, who actually does social organization and governance, which are really wonky topics, does them well in fiction or in science fiction. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that around like what kinds of systems of government, what does democracy look like in 20, 50 years' time if we're to succeed?
Well, my lord, that's hard, but it's possible. Let me see if I can gather my thoughts on this. I'm going to say that neoliberal capitalism, late capitalism, the kind of capitalism that has been in the ascendant since 1980, since Reagan Thatcher, that's been 40 years now of the privatization of the public, of the degradation and the dismissal of government, of democratic government as opposed to business government, of a certain capitalist global elite that profits from taking away people's pensions, and so cutting costs that are environmental costs, that are human costs. People used to have salaries and pensions and job security, and now everybody's in the precariat. That movement is going to have to change and come to an end for us to competently cope with the climate crisis. There's a lot of K's. Because otherwise, if it's not profitable to save the planet. In fact, it might actually be a cost. It's not the highest rate of return. So there's an incredible amount of money or capital, say it either way, sloshing around the planet looking for the highest rate of return. What you need is a poor but educated workforce that's willing to sacrifice themselves for their children. So you go to East Asian tigers, or you go Vietnam, you go somewhere where there's an educated and stable, maybe authoritarian government that will have those people work their butts off in the working class, which is to say industry, and making things like your iPhones or your cars. And then they're sacrificing themselves because their kids will have a better life. When that falls apart, and most people can't see that working for them, you're going to have to try saving the planet by some other means, because that's saving the planet isn't even on the docket of that plan. So then you need a return of the commons, you need a return of government, you need a return of solidarity, you need a return of, say you have a job guarantee, that the government is the employer of last resort, and everybody on the planet has a decent living wage. That's already interesting and would be good for the economy in some senses, because everybody could afford to buy stuff. On the other hand, if their work was landscape restoration, decarbonizing the technology base really fast, our power systems, this work can't be the random Brownian motion of highest rate of return. It's not the highest rate of return, not in any system, except for the system of longevity or sustainability. If you actually wanted humanity to survive in good style, then that should be paid as the highest rate of return. So then you get into all kinds of weird stuff. That's a wage floor I've just described, a job guarantee. What about a wage ceiling? What if you get taxed like in the Eisenhower administration, and you can't make more than $1 million or $2 million a year, and everything beyond that is owned by the government and put to good use? Well, this is already, it's just tax policy, it's just employment policy. It's not completely nuts utopianism, but it is leftism, it is pro-government. And so I'm saying there's two horizons here. On the practical one, in America, You just have to vote for government, vote for the Democratic Party, try to take over the government, try to change policies across the governmental level to make for a better relationship to the planet. On the far horizon, you might want fully automated luxury communism or some such almost unimaginable social system of the year 3000, you know. And so you can keep both horizons in your mind at once because science fiction is exactly the exercise that makes you used to that kind of long-term vision. I mean, reading science fiction is you're always doing that. So if you're asked to do it politically, it's easier to do if you have the habits of a science fiction reader. And not everybody does, but...
I mean, in that sense, thinking as a science fiction reader, I can definitely see a path that leads from the current Chinese model to that fully automated luxury communism, just as easily as from Western democracy. In other words, if China at the moment is getting better and better through techniques that currently we don't like, surveillance, mass collection of data, mass control of everything. But what they're trying to do is achieve the ultimate dream of the planned economy, the planned state. And if that could eventually evolve into something that wasn't as authoritarian but actually had the interests of citizens at heart, I mean...
Yep. I'm very interested in China, and despite the kind of almost paranoid fear in the Chinese Communist Party right now in their treatment of the public, the Chinese public gives way bigger approval ratings to the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party than Americans would give to our Congress and our political leaders. So Wang Hui talks about a crisis of representation. All around the world, are your political representatives really representing? So it isn't really democracy versus authoritarianism. It's you've got some kind of political representation. Do you trust it? Is it working for you? In China, they're going, hell yeah, it's working for us. Our government works for us. And they also have a stupendously detailed and granular local council governance. So their neighborhood is governed, and then their district of their town is governed, and then their town is governed, and then their region is governed. And at each level, they've got things going on that makes it stupendously complicated to understand from the outside. And I would bet that the United States of America is stupendously complicated to understand from the outside. And everybody in China and most Americans would say, well, I mean, with the best will in the world, I don't fully understand what's going on. And I don't trust my political representation. So China says we are socialism with Chinese characteristics, which means a hefty dose of capitalist practice, but it also is socialist at its base. The land in China is owned by the Chinese people in the form of their government. And so they claim to be socialist, and in some senses they are socialist. Here we are free market capitalists. And in both places, political representation is partial and screwed up and not good. And so what people think about it is different in both places. But if you complexify the models and you think, hey, we're still all on one planet, and despite these supposed differences, we are actually in a global economic system run by the World Trade Organization and by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all the international treaties. This is a global system. Political representation there is maybe particularly terrible for an individual citizen. But it's worth thinking about without the usual sets of labels and assumptions, because most of those I feel are oversimplifying at best.
I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. I'm going to do one last one of my own, which is somewhat science fiction-y and somewhat complex. So one of the things that worries me when we think about how we're going to deal with these challenges of the next few decades is that it seems as if our human minds, or our ability to take in and process information, is maybe a rate-limiting step. Society is so complex, the problems are so complex, we are so many and multiple, our narratives are so clashing, that to solve the kinds of problems that we need to kind of solve, it's almost like the low bit rate of human communication and the limited recall of human beings and so forth just may not be up to the task. Now, you're someone who doesn't believe in the singularity, but do you believe that there is some kind of neo-singularity-ish scenario in which we can augment human intelligence, add to it, do something that allows us to get past our current bottleneck?
I think that the singularity and artificial intelligence together, seen as one notion or idea, they are both science fiction metaphors for science itself. Science, as practiced by human beings, is incomprehensible by any one individual human. So it's a group thing. It's inaccessible to individual knowledge. It functions. It's doing stuff that keeps us all alive. Many of us in the room are still alive only because of the work of science as a thing. So you think, well, it's an artificial intelligence that is transhuman. In other words, that no one human did it. It's a group accomplishment of about 4 centuries and many millions of people, and supported by the whole civilization. So when people talk about AI, oh, it's going to take over, yeah, it did. But we are still the ones directing it, or we're in an interaction with it as a civilization and as individuals. And so the singularity, I mean, the idea, I think that people, oh, the singularity, what they're saying is our technology might be, again, maybe you're talking about this, can we comprehend it fast enough to keep up with what we as a group are inventing? And I think that's a real concern, and yet the metaphorical concern is real. The real concern is a little ridiculous, because in all of these AI singularity fantasies, you just walk over the wall and you pull out the plug, and the computers have no agency. So it's a rather hilarious problem to have, and it sort of reveals that as a real story it doesn't make sense, but as a metaphor it makes perfect sense for our feeling for what the sciences are doing and how much control or governance do we have over what sciences are doing. Well, in a way we have all the control over it. We as a civilization decide what science is going to do. In another way, we have no control over it whatsoever, because there are 8 billion of us. And our representatives are not actually representing us, but are representing capital. And so I was at Facebook headquarters. What a pretentious place. Just last week, 1 week ago, I was inside an office complex. I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement in order to even go in the front door. And hilariously, Cory Doctorow, right next to me, wouldn't sign it. And I hung with him as he had to negotiate between the Environmental Freedom Foundation and Facebook, and they eventually let Cory in anyway. I was very proud of him. But I just signed the damn thing because I went inside and I'm going to disclose it anyway, because, you know, who gives a shit? And it's like every other office complex on Earth, except they're more pretentious. And it was a bunch of social scientists, and they were having trouble comprehending civilization right now with their limited tools. Trying to apply the scientific method to humanity is really a chancy business. But one of them showed a model between what Americans want on climate change, on healthcare, et cetera, and what their representatives vote for. And the two were one of these great XY graphs where we are not getting what we vote for because our representatives are actually responding to their investors, the people that paid for them. So, yeah, we're seeing it. I mean, this is no news, but to have the social scientists put it in a big old, I call that, in fact, at the end of that, I said, that's the sky is blue research. Scientists go to this enormous effort. Yes, the sky is blue.
All right, let's have some questions. Sir, right here.
Are you familiar with Charlie Strauss's notion of the corporation as a slow AI that has taken over humanity?
Yeah, Strauss is a great science fiction writer and thinker, and I love it that one of his great books, Accelerando, the title of that comes out of Blue Mars, as he told me himself. The concept of the Accelerando. And the corporation, you know, I hate the idea that it's anything more than a legal agreement among people and basically a power relationship. So I don't like any I don't like
bureaucracy as a slow
yeah,
AI.
but I like bureaucracy. So yeah, I mean, I like science, so I like AI. AI is good.
Well, no, it depends who ran it, who programmed it, and what the program is.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, we're going to go 1, 2, 3, and then 4.
So Aurora is a generational masterpiece. It breaks all our toys in half, you know, for the entire book, that's your point. We sort of talked about it there, but it ends with this all the beaches have been drowned for 300 years, and it ends with this group of loonies who are building a new beach, or grinding the sand, and someone going down and experiencing going to the beach for the first time, which is inutterably beautiful, but it's also optimistic. Where do you stand in relation to optimism?
I'm in favor of optimism. Optimistically speaking. Yeah, I want to give a shout out to my mom, who was an optimistic person, and so that's biochemical, but also for her it was a moral position. I could see that very clearly. So you choose optimism and then you beat people with it like a club that you Since things could get better, they should get better, and therefore you act as if they're gonna get better. And so this is a kind of a moral position, or optimism as a club. And then beyond that, you also got to say, look, whether I feel optimistic or pessimistic, we still got work to do. And so our bourgeois feelings don't matter. We just do the fucking work.
I was going to ask about optimism too. New York 2140, another one of your wonderful books. It could be accused of being maybe a little excessively optimistic, though. This idea of New York turns into a beautiful Venice. An adaptation has happened. Have you felt a lot of blowback on that? Can you explain how you got there?
Well, thank you for that. I think that's right. I think that's a dangerous book in implying that, massive sea level rise, humanity would still be okay, and we would just cope. Maybe not. But what I would say is that after the period of disasters, if we hold it together, which is a big if, and continue to function as a society, the young people that come after that, that's just going to be their normal. It's going to be their normal. They're going to be looking for a job. They're going to be looking for love. They're going to be looking for the dance party on Saturday night. Well, this is a little bit of maybe that won't be the form that it takes. That's a little bit not imagining the future. But you see what I mean, that in your generational moment, you take the set position as what's normal, and you go from there. And there will be the biological reality of being an animal, getting together with other primates. So I would say that New York 2140 needs to be understood more as a metaphor of New York 2008. And that its predictive value is not as strong as its metaphorical value. And I'm trusting that people get that when they read it and see that half the book is a discussion of Ben Bernanke. I mean, why would they talk about him in 2140? So I kind of tip my hand in that book as to its present day orientation. And I shouldn't, the year 2140 is, well, that's a technical problem, but really that year is in some senses too far out, in some senses way too close. So never put a title in your, never put a year in your title. Yeah.
So the near future, more optimistic stories talking about, seems basically like you're talking about solar punk. And I wonder if you name some authors, newer authors you think who are really doing good work.
Could you repeat the
Yes,
question?
he asked about solar punk and newer authors doing really good work.
Yes.
And okay, I have to confess that I am poorly read on the newest stuff. I've been spending my time writing my own stuff, and a certain necessary and deliberate ignorance on my part is important, so that when I do something, I don't know that somebody else already did it last week. I just work in ignorance, and that way I'm free to write whatever comes to me. I've seen solar punk. This suffix in our field, punk, to represent a new literary movement, that's a bad mistake. Because punk starts as an English word with very scurrilous origins. Okay, fine. And then punk music. But punk has always represented, historically, resistance to authority, resistance to government, and a dismissal of society at large, and a kind of a fuck you attitude. That's what punk's about. Well, you say solar punk. Say you do want a better planet. Well, you're going to have to hang with other people. You're going to have to get with government programs. You're going to have to be like anti-punk. So it should be solar citizens, hope citizens. And so the punk suffix, I mean, you know me, I have always hated cyberpunk, and am the living avatar of cyberpunk's chief opponent in the world of science fiction. Yay for me. But damned if I'm going to say, oh, I love solar punk, when the same suffix is being stuck on it, and inappropriately etymologically. So, good work though. Andrew Hudson out of Arizona State, young man, he won the Arizona State contest, which was for utopian science fiction, and is an acquaintance of mine, he's young. And then young to me, and this is a little hilarious now, Cory Doctorow, Jonathan Lee from Nalo Hopkinson, tremendous writer. They are young compared to me. So, and yet they're not exactly your beginning writer 25-year-old either. So that's all I can say.
Right at the back there, and then second.
The Years of Rice and Salt is one of my absolute favorites. I'm wondering, it's a little bit different than some of your others. I'm wondering if you could just briefly tell us a little bit about the origin of it.
Sure. Thank you for that. Years of Rice and Salt is one of my very favorites of my own works, although I blew out many, many, many brain circuits, synapses that never came back. It's like circuit breakers. Circuit breakers all broke in my head at the end of Years of Rice and Salt, and nobody replaced them. I'm like not the same person I was. But it's an alternative history, and as in checking all the boxes in science fiction, alternative history needed to be checked. I've always been interested. I love history in general and feel that science fiction is historical. So when I was really young, I thought to myself one day, like one of these great out of the blue, what if all the Europeans had died of the Black Death? And then I thought, oh my God, that would mean a different world, wouldn't it? And well, yes. So I said, oh, I got to write that down. And I thought, how do you write a novel about 700 years of world history? And so I sat on it. Probably 20 years, maybe even 25 years, I sat on that idea thinking, well, it's a great idea, but I can't write it. But after the Mars trilogy, I had the method. So I applied the same method that I used in the Mars trilogy to this alternative history and did the 700 years. It was about 3 years of my life. I had about 500 books sitting there in a pile around me on the floor. It makes a great photograph. Only about 10 of those books were crucial, but they were truly crucial. And I didn't know enough to write that book, so it was a shot in the dark. But thank you.
Where did the idea of having the bottom in that book come from?
You know, in the Mars books, I got characters to exist through the whole 200 years by way of longevity treatments. I had used that trick. Wasn't appropriate to the other one. I needed characters. I don't believe in the multi-generational saga. Like, say, even the best of them, 100 Years of Solitude. You know Ursula, you know Jose Arcadia. Their great-grandchildren in the last chapters, who are they? What do you know about them? You don't care about them. And I believe that that's a systemic problem with the multi-generational narrative. So I wanted characters living from beginning to end. 700 years, really? So reincarnation. This was my, they just keep coming back. There's only 3 characters in the Years of Rice and Salt, which is a little bit spooky, but rather, you know, a form, you pick a form and it determines everything else that follows it. And I quite loved the experience of that book, especially chapter 6, The Widow Kang. That was like a visitation. And as a writer, you hope for visitations, but they don't come that often. And if you're going to be honest about it, it's mostly just like cardboard and work. It's stage magic. But if you work hard enough, every once in a while, you will get a visitation, and then you're just channeling.
So I'm actually really glad to ask this question right after the last one. How would you recommend going about, if it is at all possible as a matter of craft, writing multi-generational sagas? Different characters across different generations of a long, centuries-long time period, without reincarnation or extreme longevity or anything of that nature. Is it even possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like form questions and craft questions, and luckily an idea occurred to me, or else I'd just say, I don't know, it's impossible, but maybe not. If the problem is that you don't care about the late characters as much as the early ones, you've got to flip that. So the first parts of the book about the first characters should be short and impressionistic, maybe, like almost to crush to a prose poem. You got 10 pages about Grandpa founding the town. You got 200 pages about great-great-granddaughter. That might even out the balance, so that you do end up caring about the later generations, because you just know more about them and you hang with them longer. And I might steal that one myself. I mean, that might solve that problem. I don't know.
Thank you.
You now's a science fiction convention because it's only been guys who've asked the question so far.
Oh, here we go.
Thank you.
Yes.
So earlier you talked about speaking to your audience and being free to do certain things. And I find that, as science fiction fans, we're really good at imagining different futures. And so when faced with the climate crisis, we're really good at thinking about what could happen. But mundane world doesn't think about that. They think everything's going to go on the way it's always been. Do you think about trying to talk more to those people in some of your novels about climate change to try to get them to start thinking about the fact that it isn't going to go on the way they're thinking it's always been?
Yes, thank you for that. And I am doing my best, and luckily, partly because of the science fiction community, my books have crossed over to a certain limited extent. And I think you'll recognize what I'm saying, that the science fiction field, the writers, some of them are like the mayors of science fiction, and they organize us as a community, but are basically internal to the community. And some are like ambassadors of science fiction and are out there on the borders speaking to the world outside. Some magical writers are both mayor and ambassador at the same time. Some of them say, I don't know, Bradbury or George R.R. Martin. But typically, you can kind of type your writers. And I've always been an ambassador. I only come to wonderful conventions like this one. I don't do much of this kind of thing, but I do have a presence in the larger world as a speaker, as an ex-academic, as the guy that wrote these books. And what I find is that really everybody's a science fiction writer now, in that they all try to imagine their good future and they're scared of their bad future. So it's a habit of mind that although we've trained it by consistent practice and can be very granular about it, everybody's got the ability and does it for their own personal lives. So it's very easy to talk about good futures versus bad futures, and just, especially talking in college classes. You get a job, you find someone you like, you can have a good life, or you don't get a job, you end up somehow screwing up. So they're utopian and dystopian in their imaginations. So I do my best to spread a utopian message across the world, and it's peculiar and interesting to have that role of a public intellectual, because really the public intellectual has kind of gone away. We're in the social media society. There's no such thing. In the post-war period or in the 19th century, there were public intellectuals. Now it's like, well, we're all public intellectuals. What would one be? But I do get to speak as a science fiction writer, and it has a status that it did not have when I was young, and when many of you out here were young, and a lot of you can remember the status of science fiction in the culture at large in the 1960s, and fewer of us now, but back into the 50s. Well, it's not that way anymore. We are in a big science fiction novel, and so when we come out there and say, well, I'm a science fiction writer, they're like, whoa, you're a specialist on now. And that's just different, and it's a good feeling.
I just want to say I really enjoyed Shaman.
Well, thank you.
And one of the things I enjoyed about it is sort of the emotional complexity, not only the visual sense, kind of educated. And I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about it.
Sure. The question was about Shaman, my novel about the Paleolithic, about the Chauvet Caves, and I want to say that's another checked box, because the Paleolithic novel is a science fiction story. Is just running backwards in history to where we can't know it, rather than forwards in history to where we can't know it. And Silverberg and Michael Bishop, there is a small but significant, Cecilia Holland, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, there's a small but significant body of period historic literature, Peter Dickinson. These are quite beautiful books, and they're basically put in our part of the bookstores. I wanted to do one. When they found the Iceman in that glacier between Italy and Austria, I said, that guy's got exactly the same backpacking gear I've got. He's just using the materials of his time, but everything was precisely the same in terms of function and design. Blew my mind. I wanted to write about it. And then the Chauvet Cave was so beautiful, and it was twice as old as Lascaux. So the idea that art had developed from primitive leaf scratches on the wall, and then it got up to the point of Lascaux, and then started going downhill from there. Well, even that model didn't work, because 32,000 years ago, we were doing incredibly beautiful artwork. I just wanted to talk about those people. And I had to make the assumptions. They had language in full. They had the same DNA we did, everything except for lactose tolerance. They were all lactose intolerant then. And about 17 to 15,000 years ago, when we started herding sheep and goats and cows, then we began to build lactose tolerance. It makes perfect sense. But other than that, they were the same as us. And there they were. They didn't know as much as us about the cosmos, but they knew more about their watershed than you know about your watershed. And I wanted to write about that. Thoroughly modern, highly intelligent. You could even argue that just as dogs are like degraded wolves, we are degraded Paleolithics. We tamed ourselves. We are domesticated humans.
Our brains are actually smaller than people.
Yeah, they had larger brains. I mean, I don't know if that's relevant, but for sure they were as smart as us. And so what were they doing? What were they thinking? And if they're in little groups, like a group this size would be maybe the largest gathering. And then those are the only people you know all your life, except for occasional Burning Man festivals. You'd know everybody really well. I mean, you would know who you got along with and who you didn't get along with. You would know who you could trust and who you couldn't trust. You would have knives in your back. I mean, these would be paper bullets in the brain. In a community like ours, you know what that's like. Everybody knows what that's like. You would know who put those knives in there and who was trying to take them out or who didn't believe in them. I mean, you would know all that stuff, because that would be your full study, your full society. It struck me as fascinating, and it was one of my favorite projects ever. And I'll end my Shaman riff by saying that poor old Orbit, my publisher, belongs to Hachette, and Hachette was in a ferocious war with Amazon.com over how to split the rights to how to split the profits. And they went to the mattresses. And so when Shaman came out, the page on Amazon said, "We can deliver this book in 6 weeks, but you might want to read Clan of the Cave Bear instead." I wish I had taken a screenshot. I wasn't that canny, because that's what it said. And so Shaman had a start. It was, you know how the 75% of a book sells within the first 2 weeks of publication or some such figure? You can imagine. Oh, and the reader of the audiobook is fabulously good. I love the reader of the audiobook.
Roar. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Please get attention.
Well, a song about never saying never and never being told what you can or cannot do. This is one of us. A 1, 2, 3. Fighting, or when fighting got to me, I looked to find examples on the field of chivalry, and I saw mighty arms, much stronger than my arms could ever be. So I thought perhaps that field was not for me. But still I stayed and watched the fighting till one figure stood apart, in armor newly fashioned and a helm more pot than art. But each blow is thrown with honor and a lightness of the heart. So I took that step which soon became a start. 'Cause she was not the biggest fighter, nor one to raise a fuss, but I remember being proud that she was one of us. And we might never stand together in a shield wall side by side. Because of her I lift my sword with pride. She was ladylike and lively, not the type you would expect, with a braver heart than many and a slot shot to respect. And I guess she'd once decided this was where she'd like to be, and I thought if she could do it, why not me? 'Cause she was not the biggest fighter, nor one to raise a fight.